Okay, well, I'm just delighted to be here. It's such a kind of coming together of lots of organisations that I really respect and have sort of followed the development of over the years, obviously with the RSA and Landscape Institute and Forum for the Future coming together with some, I hope, interesting insights for you about this whole question about where we're going on the landscape debate. I am going to start deliberately with encouragement from colleagues in the Landscape Institute many, many, many miles away from the UK. I am pretty sure that our debate will eventually settle back here in the UK when it comes to thinking about landscape and land use. But let's be honest, our debate in the UK about landscape and land use does tend pretty quickly to settle into very familiar and, dare I say it, even cosy tram lines. And I thought it might just be a little bit counterintuitive to open this up and see where the whole debate is going about sustainable land use globally, because it is in that kind of bigger context that we will eventually get to grips with sustainable land use here in the UK. And I can assure you we have not got to grips with that here in the UK as yet. So I want to start with this big story about competition for land. Ever since 2008, when, as you will recall, there was a massive and extremely disconcerting spike in food prices, a lot of factors that caused that, there has been a gathering awareness in academia, in politics, in the world of farming in particular, that land is a finite commodity, that the uses to which we can put it are confined. We have no limitless ability to use land for multifunctional purposes. And with a population that continues to grow, and I promise not to bang on too much about population this evening, but I do hope you all, somewhere deep in your heart, understand that most of this stuff is driven by continuing increases in human numbers the world over. A lot of this competition for land has at its core a combination of increased numbers every year, roughly 80 million more people at the end of every year than there were at the start of it, and more of those people are getting richer and therefore making more demands on that finite land base, which is not going to increase. There are many other things we can increase, but we absolutely can't increase the land itself. So competition for land is now huge, and from an agronomic point of view, a sort of perspective of functional uses of the land, what you're beginning to see is some extremely sharp trade-offs between what we can get from each hectare of productive land today. The UN has just brought out a new report around food security and land use, came out at the end of last week, which said very clearly, if you really want to see the world move towards sustainable land use globally, then you're going to have to eat less meat and stop using land for biofuels. Pretty simple, trenchant headlines. Because at the moment, the competition for land reduces down to what are called the 5 Fs. And it's quite helpful to think about this. You can actually sometimes combine some of these Fs, but it's not easy. The first is food, for direct human consumption, obviously by far the most important use from a functional point of view. The second is the use of that land for feed, which eventually ends up as food for us, but firstly it passes through livestock, so producing feed for animals for use in human diets. Thirdly, fibre, and we use a lot of land and a growing amount of land to produce cotton, because as people have more people buying more clothes, that's the inevitable consequence of that little growth spur. We have increasing the use of land for fuel, so the raw material coming off the land going into the fuel chain, not into the food chain. And to a smaller degree, but this will get significantly more important over the next few years, we are seeing more productive land being used to produce the feedstock for the chemicals industry. So sourcing biological feedstocks rather than hydrocarbon, essentially oil-based feedstocks for the chemical industry. So the 5 Fs, food, feed, fibre, feedstock, and fuel, are in themselves causing pretty fierce competition, as you can imagine. And I haven't even started to talk about ecosystem services, because by and large when agronomists are getting going on competition for land, they don't tend to talk about ecosystem services. They don't even seem to recognize sometimes that all of their production, for whatever purpose it might be, is actually completely dependent on the capacity of that combination of natural assets to produce the services on which human productivity depends. I haven't even started to talk about aesthetics, of course, because when we're talking about functional uses of land, aesthetics is in another box somewhere, and I certainly haven't started to talk about use of the land for development purposes, which is a huge issue. Whenever you're travelling anywhere in the world, we think we've got a big issue about that here in the UK. We haven't got an issue at all about that here in the UK, relative to the issues as they are now exploding very dangerously from the perspective of social stability in China, in India, Brazil, Indonesia, and so on. So we have to anticipate that one of the most important megatrends which will shape geopolitical fortunes all around the world is competition for land, and what that actually is going to mean. How can we possibly get better at defining what sustainable land use means against that kind of backdrop? How do we do this? And let me just come at this a little bit obliquely. We are seeing lots of efforts going on to make sure that single crop production systems should be done more sustainably, to make sure that certain special places are set aside or protected, whatever it might be. Malaysia, for instance, where I've just come back from, is extremely proud of the fact that it has set aside voluntarily 50% of its forests and made it inviolate, has decreed that it will not be put to any further economic development purposes. So we're seeing all sorts of initiatives going on around the world to try and define what sustainable land use looks like in particular crop systems, particular areas, particular special designations, whatever it might be. But we don't really have an understanding of what sustainable land use looks like in a more holistic way. This is causing fantastic friction in the system, as you can imagine. Just think for a moment how we wrestle with just one big and important crop in the world today, namely palm oil. Very controversial. Lots of people think that producing palm oil at all is absolutely wicked and that it should somehow be banned, that we should have boycott campaigns to get rid of palm oil in the food chain, get rid of palm oil in sort of beauty products, or whatever it might be. Totally ridiculous idea. The livelihoods of millions of people in Indonesia, in Malaysia and elsewhere depend on the production of palm oil. And it is perfectly possible to produce palm oil in genuinely sustainable ways. It's perfectly possible. There is something called the Round Table on Sustainable Palm Oil, which has made a pretty good stab at defining what sustainable palm oil production would actually look like. So what we're seeing in all of these sort of areas, so in soya, for instance, soybean farmers are now grudgingly getting involved in a round table on sustainable soybean production. Sugar producers the world over are now getting involved in a round table equivalent to think how you can grow sugar more sustainably, whether that's in South America, India, wherever it might be. And crop by crop, product by product, commodity by commodity, we're kind of getting our heads around the fact that some production systems are more or less sustainable, if we're lucky. Some are absolutely not sustainable, and most of it's really roughly in the middle. But you can imagine from a more holistic point of view that this really doesn't make a great deal of sense. Because what we're not doing is moving towards concepts of sustainable land use at a landscape scale, if I can put it like that. Now, this is where we're going to get into the first of our definitional problems tonight, which is what do we mean by landscape scale. I hope we don't have to dive too deep into that particular conundrum, because I'm sure that members of the Institute have enjoyed that debate for, well, ever. Probably since the start of the Institute's illustrious history. But it is quite vexing sometimes to see how people are using the concept of landscape very differently from what you might think they mean by it. So when I talk about landscape scale, I'm essentially talking about a whole region or sub-region or bioregion, because actually when we need to think about sustainable land use, many of our rather arbitrary lines on a map are not helpful at all. But bioregionalism, where you define the properties or the attributes of an area against its natural features, take a watershed, for instance, as the most obvious way of classifying a bioregion rather than a subregion. When you begin to look at it from that point of view, then you can see what spatial scale actually means. For all sorts of reasons, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Bank, UNDP, UNEP, large food companies in the world today, Unilever, Nestle, Mondelez, are now beginning to look at what would it mean to work towards a set of practices that allowed people to talk about sustainable land use and management on a spatial scale, on a big regional or sub-regional scale. And that's very intriguing. Hitherto, most of those big food companies, Forum for the Future does a lot of work, for instance, with Unilever, have put all their eggs in the basket of third-party certification. So get the Rainforest Alliance to go and certify all the tea that Unilever grows. Get Fair Trade to go and do some work on other raw materials in their supply chain. Ask Bonsucro, which is a big Brazilian certifying and accreditation body, to give a stamp of approval on sugar production for Unilever in India, wherever it might be. So they've said, let's pick off all these different crops. Let's try and get some credibility into the marketplace to prove that we're doing our best to manage these crops on a sustainable basis. And the RSPO, of course, for palm oil. But they've suddenly realized that a huge food producer of that kind cannot possibly certify all the raw material, produce, coming from every single hectare of productive land all over the world on that notion of single crop certification systems. Transactionally, it's incredibly complex, it's incredibly expensive, it doesn't give you the kind of guarantees that you'd really like. You may certify one crop on 1 hectare of land one year, but guess what? Another crop's being grown on that hectare of land the next year. So how do you get this more integrated, holistic, landscape scale approach to sustainable land use? Okay, so you can see, with competition for land becoming a mega driver of security issues the world over, it has given that concept of food security rather more additional bite than it's ever had before. Within that kind of context, you can see how people are now struggling to conceptualize a framework within which you could make the concept of sustainable land use come alive. Now, this is something that we are very interested in the Forum for the Future. We started in 1996. One of the first programs that we ever launched in 1998 was a big program working with a number of landowners around the UK, large estates, in fact, the kind of land holding where continuity of mission and purpose is pretty much a given. So if you work with the Grosvenor Estates, for instance, the Duke of Westminster, they sort of think they cracked sustainability about 4 centuries ago. It was quite interesting to have a piece of work that said, how do you conceptualize what sustainability means on estates, big estates, that have been managed from one generation to the next over time, so that you really do this business of protecting all the assets in that holding in such a way that you create the value that you need from those assets, but hopefully bring those assets into an even more productive state, an even more fit-for-purpose state than the point at which you inherited them from all of those generations. We brought that together in what we started to call the 5 Capitals Framework for Sustainable Asset Management, which is a rather odd way of looking at it, but how do you begin to get integrated approach to the use of natural capital, so what it is in any estate or land holding that is dependent on the natural assets on that holding. I'll come back to the use of this language in a minute. The human capital, because clearly this is a phenomenally important part of generating ongoing value, generation after generation. The social value, all of these estates have deep connectivities into local communities going back not just decades, but sometimes hundreds of years. Manufactured capital, all the big assets that large estates use. As you know, they make huge investments in buildings, in plant, in agricultural machinery, and so on. And lastly, of course, financial capital. How do you protect the financial assets of an entity of that kind so that they are secured over time to produce a yield? In the case of the Grosvenor Estates, quite a generous yield. How do you protect those assets over time? And if you look at those 5 different stocks of capital, natural, human, social, manufactured, and financial, and you develop what we call an optimizing framework, you can see how all of those different stocks of capital can be managed over time to optimize the yields from those stocks of capital indefinitely into the future. Which, of course, is the definition of sustainability. We've all got that point fixed. But what we're talking about here is how do we secure the ability to use land to the advantage of humankind, which includes the ecosystem services, by the way, indefinitely into the future. That project lasted 6 years. It was fantastic. We had a very good engagement with a lot of people. We then decided to see if we could roll it out to the farming community more broadly. That got a little bit more complicated at that point. 15 years on, we're now doing pretty much the same project with a rather different kind of estate here in the UK, namely the Crown Estate. Crown Estate, one of the biggest landowners in the UK, one of the most important economic players in terms of defining what land use strategies should be promoted, and now one of the most ambitious economic agents in the country when it comes to trying to define sustainable asset management in that way. Notwithstanding the very beady eye of various Treasury ministers, who of course are focused primarily on the financial capital assets of the Crown Estate, there is a realization in the Crown Estate itself that it has to manage its assets indefinitely over time, which means optimizing yields on all of those other stocks of capital, human, social, natural, and manufactured. Now, how comfortable are you with this kind of language? As soon as people start reducing their cherished landscapes and the places where they live to a set of capital assets, there's a kind of scrunching going on in people. Because by and large, when we love a place, we really don't like to see it described as a capital asset. The two things sit pretty uncomfortably together. So when it comes to asset-based approaches to land, there has been some nervousness on the part of the environment movement, to say the least, about giving away the whole linguistic game, as it were, this framing, conceptualization process, by summoning up some of the key aspects of the wicked system called capitalism. And a lot of environmentalists are deep antipathetic to... What did the chair say about phones? Deeply antipathetic to the notion of turning all of this into some kind of attempt to bring capitalism down to that level. But actually it's extremely helpful. For a moment, forget the language. Just begin to think about optimizing flows of benefits to humankind over time from different sources of wealth in any one landscape area, in any one region, whatever it might be. Okay, so my question to you for this evening is, how well prepared do you think we are to move towards integrated land use management approaches of that kind? looking at it from an asset-based approach, which takes into account ecosystem services, okay, through the natural capital side. It takes into account all our concerns about aesthetics through the human capital side, because they're crucially important, but allows us to think about all of those things in a much more integrated, holistic, synthesizing framework than is currently the case. Now, my pitch to you is that we're not very well prepared for that at all. Our planning system, despite endless attempts to reform this over time, is essentially one driven by pretty crude trade-off dynamics. So most proposals are taken into the planning system and driven through it essentially by saying, here's a set of economic benefits that we hope we can achieve. Yes, there may be some collateral damage in the system in terms of impact on people and place and landscape and ecosystems and so on, but guess what? This economic benefit outweighs all of those costs. And despite the fact, going back a long time now, the planning profession has sought to bring forward more nuanced ways of looking at optimized outcomes from different planning processes. Essentially, we still do trade-off. That's essentially what we still do. And one of the reasons for that, and this gets to the heart of what I'm sure we'll want to talk about this evening, is the planning profession may not necessarily be capable of doing it in any other way. If you look at training for professionals, all professionals involved in land use decisions of one kind or another, planning, development control, professional advice about how to maximize the benefits of any different system, you have to ask a question about how well prepared our professional bodies are to make more holistic, integrated, optimizing decisions about land use in that way. And I suspect, if I've read this correctly through Merrick and others, that this is a big debate now for the Landscape Institute itself. What is the consequence of today's sustainability imperative? And I use those words very advisedly, because there are still a ton of politicians in this country, in fact, the vast majority, who think that sustainability is some kind of choice. Either we'll do it or we won't. They don't get the concept of the sustainability imperative, and I have to say this is true of this coalition government. It was largely true of the Labour government before this. It wasn't seen as imperative. They did a damn sight better job than this coalition government is doing, but nobody really understood the degree to which these changing factors around climate change, resource efficiency, competition for land and other assets create an imperative for politicians they can't turn away from. The vast majority of politicians in this country turn away from it. And that is why most of the time when they fiddle with the planning profession, which they love to do, this coalition government has done it more perniciously than almost any of its predecessors, but they all do it. They never get to the heart of the story, which is what are the professional skills that planners need to enable local communities to be advised professionally about better ways of arriving at optimized outcomes for local communities. So it's a problem, because politicians love to meddle in planning, as we all know. And they all have very strong views about planning. Then you have to listen to Nick Bowles on one of his little outings into the further reaches of how the free market would free planning from its miserable, wretched, anti-growth constraints that it suffers from today, to understand precisely how stupid this ideological orientation can actually be. Love him dearly, obviously, but it would help if he just engaged the brain occasionally before opening his mouth. So politicians will continue to intervene. They will continue to meddle in this way. Are the professions really doing as good a job as they need to do to come up with their own responses to this sustainability imperative? Here I'm going to cheat rotten. I'm going to quote from Merrick, because this is a very interesting challenge. I hope you don't mind. This is maybe a private paper, but you sent it to me, so it can't be that confidential, because you knew I'd be tempted to use it outrageously. So in Merrick's paper, this is a note for the Advisory Council of the Planning Institute on the Future of the Landscape Profession, which I believe is now doing the rounds. He asks this. Well, he makes the challenge to start with. This is to bring it home for us here now, back in the UK, back in the Institute. It could be argued that the Institute has unwittingly jeopardized its future by giving emphasis to the wrong set of skills that are of interest to the public and positioned ourselves in the wrong place in the world of development. By emphasizing good design, which is obviously central to the Institute's work, by emphasizing good design, the public perception is that we're advocating aesthetic qualities, a highly subjective outcome which is inevitably attached to the arts, and a luxury, design a luxury, this is deliberately provocative, that society is clearly saying we might do without in times of financial hardship. A nice to have rather than a must have. Now, I'm not sufficiently informed about the degree to which planning processes for landscape architects and for people involved in this whole notion have fallen into that trap of being steered towards a design end of things rather than an integrated functionality, multifunctional sustainability end of things, but that is really a very important question. So Merrick says, we are at yet another crossroad. Do we as a profession want to confine our prospects to working in the main around architects and engineers, with a minority only working to a wider brief, or are we prepared now to work outside our comfort zone, using our skills and knowledge to fully embrace the sustainability imperative? So that, it seems to me, is absolutely the question now confronting the profession, confronting all professionals involved in land use. It seems to me that we do not give professionals, graduates entering into those professions, anything like the grounding that they need, the skill sets that they require to actually fulfill the service that will be asked of them as we grapple with these mega issues around competition for land, optimized yields from a given set of assets in any one particular area. For me, it's pretty bloody staggering that many, many years after the Earth Summit in 1972, when people did begin to say pretty clearly, we know that our current way of doing things is inherently unsustainable and now we have to find more sustainable ways of doing it. It's pretty staggering even now that when you scan down the skills that professionals entering into, young professionals entering into a profession are being given access to, they are largely fit for yesterday and absolutely unfit for the complicated decisions they'll have to make for tomorrow. So definitely plenty to chew on there. I'm 30 seconds ahead of time.
Thank you, John.